What if one of the fiercest climate arguments of our time was hiding inside a 70-year silence on the surface of the sun? Not an explosion, not a flood, not a machine. A silence. Between 1645 and 1715, sunspots nearly vanished. The sun appeared strangely quiet. Europe shivered through brutal winters. Rivers froze. Harvests failed. Pain spread slowly, season by season. History would later call that solar calm the Maunder Minimum. Most scientists treated it as one chapter in a much bigger climate story. But one man refused to let that chapter close. Willie Soon kept asking a question that made many people uncomfortable. What if the sun mattered more than we want to admit? And once that question is asked, another one follows. If the sun helped shape the past, how much of the present are we misunderstanding? This is the story of the Maunder Minimum. But even more, it is a story of the climate question Willie Soon refused to drop. Willie Soon did not build his reputation by following the safe path. For years, he stood in a place where science, politics, reputation, and public anger collided. An astrophysicist with a long interest in the relationship between solar behavior and Earth's climate, Soon kept coming back to one central belief. Before we make huge claims about climate, we need to understand the star that powers the entire system. To his supporters, that sounded reasonable, even necessary. To his critics, it sounded like something else entirely. A distraction, a distortion, a way of throwing doubt into a field where the bigger picture, in their view, was already clear. And that is what made Willie Soon such a lightning rod. Because he was not just arguing about temperature charts. He was challenging the hierarchy of causes. He was saying, in effect, maybe the climate story begins higher above our heads than many are willing to admit. Now ask yourself this. If a scientist keeps returning to an unpopular question for years, is that persistence a sign of courage or a refusal to accept evidence? That tension sits at the center of Willie Soon's story. And nowhere did it burn more intensely than in his fixation on the Maunder Minimum. To understand why, we need to go back. The Maunder Minimum is one of the most famous quiet periods in solar history. For decades, sunspots became extremely rare. Modern research strongly supports that this was a real and unusually deep drop in solar activity. That matters because sunspots are not random stains on the sun. They are visible signs of magnetic activity, part of a wider solar engine that affects radiation, solar wind, and behavior of the upper atmosphere around Earth. Soon looked at that silence and saw more than a historical curiosity. He saw a challenge. If the sun could fall into such an extraordinary low, and if that low overlapped with colder conditions during the broader Little Ice Age, then why, he asked, was the sun being treated as a minor actor in climate history? That question sounds simple. It is not simple, because climate is never one thing. Volcanoes matter. Oceans matter. Atmospheric chemistry matters. Land use matters. Orbital cycles matter. Feedback loops matter. And that is precisely why this argument became so explosive. Willie Soon was not just pointing to the sun. He was pushing against a growing scientific consensus that recent global warming is overwhelmingly driven by greenhouse gases from human activity. In other words, he was not merely asking for one factor to be added. He was asking whether the weighting of the entire system had been misjudged. That is a very different claim. And claims like that do not drift quietly through science. They collide. Soon's public position became clear over time. Solar variability, in his view, had been underestimated, while the role of carbon dioxide had been overstated. He argued that climate records across centuries made more sense if solar forcing was taken much more seriously. He repeatedly returned to historical periods like the Maunder Minimum because they seemed to offer a natural experiment. The sun changed. Climate changed. So why, he asked, should anyone treat that connection as marginal? For viewers at home, that argument can feel powerful. It has elegance. It has narrative force. And maybe that is part why it spread so far beyond academic journals. Because it offers a very human kind of logic. If the sun is the source of energy for Earth, how could it not be central to climate? That is the intellectual hook Willie Soon kept driving into public debate. And to be fair, mainstream climate science does not say the sun is irrelevant. It absolutely is relevant. Solar influence is real. The Maunder Minimum was real. Researchers continue to study how low solar activity may have contributed to cooling, especially in combination with volcanic activity and changes in ocean circulation. But the major scientific institutions do not follow Soon to his broader conclusion. That is where the line is drawn. The mainstream answer is this: yes, solar variability affects climate, but no, it does not explain most modern warming. That distinction is everything. And it is exactly the distinction Willie Soon kept pressing against. Here is where the documentary must slow down, because this argument survives on confusion if we rush it. The Maunder Minimum happened roughly from 1645 to 1715. During that time, the sun's visible spot activity dropped dramatically. This period overlapped with colder conditions inside the larger span, often called the Little Ice Age, especially in parts of the northern hemisphere. But overlap is not the same as total causation. That is one of the most important scientific points in this entire story. Modern assessments from agencies like NASA and NOAA say the Maunder Minimum may have contributed to cooling, but they do not treat it as the single master switch behind the Little Ice Age. Other factors, especially volcanic aerosols and natural ocean variability, are considered major parts of the picture. And when scientists turn from past centuries to modern warming, the gap widens even more. Satellite measurements over recent decades do not show a rise in solar output large enough to explain the warming we have seen. NOAA states that changes in the sun's brightness since the pre-industrial era made only a very small contribution to recent warming. NASA goes even further in plain language. Even a future grand solar minimum would, at best, only offset a small fraction of human-caused warming for a limited time. So, why didn't that settle the question for Willie Soon? Because Soon was not satisfied with narrow measurements alone. He looked at historical climate patterns, long time scales, proxy records, and the possibility that solar effects might be amplified through mechanisms scientists still do not fully understand. And that is where the conflict deepened. Not because Soon claimed the sun exists. Everyone agrees on that. But because he kept suggesting that the official balance of evidence might be missing something fundamental. Now think about that for a second. What is harder to defeat in public debate? A claim that is obviously absurd? Or a claim that sounds just plausible enough to keep the door open? Willie Soon lived inside that second category. The Maunder Minimum as a symbol. For Soon, the Maunder Minimum was not just a historical event. It was evidence with emotional power. A warning from the archive. A reminder that nature does not move in straight lines. A challenge to scientific arrogance. At least, that is how many listeners heard him. He could point to a quiet Sunday. He could point to colder centuries. He could ask why people were so certain about a climate system that still contains enormous complexity. And in an age where many people distrust institutions, that style of argument lands hard, because it does not ask the audience to master every dataset. It asks something more psychologically seductive. What if the experts became too sure? That question is gasoline in any public controversy. And Soon understood, whether instinctively or deliberately, that uncertainty itself can become a stage. But science is not judged by the emotional force of question. It is judged by how well the evidence holds when other specialists attack it. And attack it they did. One of the biggest controversies surrounding Willie Soon came from his broader solar climate work and the reaction it triggered inside the scientific community. His name became closely tied to arguments that historical climate swings, including warmth in earlier centuries, pointed to a stronger solar role than mainstream climate science allowed. Some of his most discussed work was heavily criticized for methodological weaknesses and for stretching evidence further than other specialists thought it could go. This was not mild disagreement. It was fierce. Critics argued that Soon was blurring regional climate episodes into global conclusions. They argued that he was using evidence in ways that created a misleading impression of scientific support. In one famous controversy connected to this line of research, the backlash became so intense that editors resigned from the journal that had published the paper. That is not routine scientific debate. That is rupture. Later, another layer of controversy deepened the damage. Scrutiny over his funding and disclosure practices. For many critics, that transformed the story from a dispute about methods into a dispute about credibility itself. And once credibility becomes the issue, every argument gets reread through suspicion. To some people, that settled the matter. Case closed. To others, it did the opposite. It made Soon look like a dissenter punished for challenging an orthodoxy. That split is one reason his name still carries such force. Because this was never just about charts. It became a battle over who gets to define legitimate doubt. The scientific reaction to Soon's climate arguments was, in broad terms, relentless. Mainstream assessments from major institutions have repeatedly concluded that recent warming cannot be explained primarily by changes in solar activity. Observational evidence cuts strongly against that view. The atmosphere is warming in patterns more consistent with greenhouse gas forcing than with a simple increase in solar output. The stratosphere has cooled while the lower atmosphere has warmed, a fingerprint that scientists say does not fit the idea of the sun as the main modern driver. Research on the Maunder Minimum itself also became sharper. A major 2015 paper in astronomy and astrophysics concluded that solar activity during the Maunder Minimum was indeed exceptionally low, and it rejected claims that activity had actually been moderate or high during that period. In other words, the sun really was unusually quiet. But confirming that fact did not rescue the broader argument that solar changes are driving most current warming. And that is the paradox at the heart of Willie Soon's story. The scientific world did not reject the Maunder Minimum. It rejected the leap. Yes, the sun matters. Yes, the Maunder Minimum was profound. Yes, low solar activity may have contributed to earlier cooling. But no, that does not mean the sun explains the warming pattern of the modern era. That is the mainstream position. Clear, direct, repeated, and Willie Soon kept pushing back anyway. So here is the real question for you. When a scientist keeps returning to a disputed idea after the broader field has moved on, what are you looking at? Commitment to truth? Attachment to a theory? Or the stubborn, uncomfortable engine that sometimes drives science forward? Be honest. How many times in history have experts dismissed questions too early? And how many times have charismatic outsiders mistaken doubt for discovery? That is why Willie Soon is so hard to place neatly. Because he forces a deeper discomfort. Not just, is he right? But, how do we decide who deserves to keep asking? Willie Soon's appeal has never depended only on technical details. It comes from his role in the drama. He is the man who kept pointing upward. The man who would not let the sun leave the conversation. The man who treated the Maunder Minimum not as a footnote, but as a challenge to modern certainty. For viewers, that creates a powerful emotional frame. A lone researcher against a consensus. A forbidden question. A hidden cause. A scientific establishment defending the official story. That frame is compelling even when the evidence does not fully support the conclusion. And this is where many documentaries fail. They either turn Soon into a hero, or they turn him into a villain. But real tension lives in the middle, because a person can raise a legitimate question about solar influence and still draw conclusions most specialists reject. A person can be persistent and still be wrong. A person can challenge groupthink and still create confusion. Those things can all be true at once. And maybe that is the hardest kind of story to tell honestly. In the end, the Maunder Minimum did not prove Willie Soon right, but explains why he would not stop asking. It gave him a historical stage where the sun seemed to whisper into climate history. It offered an opening, a pattern, a provocation. It let him ask whether modern climate science had locked onto one answer too tightly and pushed another answer too far to the edge. The scientific world answered him, again and again. The sun is part of the story, but not the main author of modern warming. Soon answered back, in effect, you are still underestimating the star that makes all life possible. That clash is why his work still provokes such strong reactions. Not because the Maunder Minimum is obscure, but because it sits at the fault line between two very different instincts. One instinct says the evidence is now strong enough to be clear. The other says history is full of moments when clarity arrived too soon. And maybe that is why this debate has survived for so long. Because it is not only about climate. It is about confidence, about institutions, about dissent, about which uncertainties matter, and which ones become excuses. Willie Soon refused to drop the climate question tied to the Maunder Minimum because, to him, it was never a dead issue. It was a a test of whether science still had room for uncomfortable possibilities. Most experts believe that test has already been passed, and that the answer is in. Soon never accepted that finality. And now the question turns to you. When you look at the quiet sun of the Maunder Minimum, what do you see? A historical clue that was worth pushing? Or a doorway that led too many people away from the stronger evidence? That judgment matters. Because in the modern information war, the most powerful ideas are not always the ones that are proven. Sometimes they're the ones that keep a question alive. If this story challenged what you thought you knew, tell me in the comments. Was Willie Soon asking a necessary scientific question, or holding on to a theory the evidence left behind? And if you want more deep, serious breakdowns focused only on Willie Soon, his research, his arguments, and the scientific reaction to them, subscribe now and stay with this channel. Because sometimes the most dangerous force in science is not a wrong answer. It is a question that refuses to die.